Hey there, tonight we're not going to talk about kings or knights, nor the clash of steel on the battlefield. Instead, we'll descend into something quieter, stranger, and far more unsettling. This is a story about what it meant to heal in a world where illness was both a curse and a punishment, and where saving a life could just as easily end your own. So dim the lights, let the world outside fade, and follow me into the shadowed alleys and sour-smelling huts where the medieval doctors worked, prayed, and often died. They called him Physicker John. Not out of respect, not quite mockery, just the kind of name peasants gave a man they half feared and half needed. He wasn't a priest, he wasn't a barber, but he had a sack full of tools and a way of staring at wounds like they owed him money. John had once apprenticed under a monk in the hills of Avonford, a man who taught him how to boil linen, how to check the tongue for plague, and how to read the Book of Cures without vomiting. When the monastery burned during the pox riots, John walked east, alone, sick himself, but still breathing. He arrived in Blewer's Hollow just after a thunderstorm, soaked to the bone, a scrap of waxed parchment in his hand, declaring him fit to treat the afflicted. They housed him in the old tithing barn, where the rats had grown brave and the roof wept nightly. Still, he unpacked his things carefully: iron pincers, blood bowls, a jar of crushed garlic, 3 scorched medical texts, and a pouch of leeches. On his second night, they brought him a boy. 8, maybe 9, pale as a funeral sheet. He hadn't spoken in 2 days. His eyes rolled in his head like they were searching for the way out. John examined him by candlelight: swollen glands, blood behind the ears, a tongue blackened at the tip. The signs were clear, but they brought no certainty, just a list of wrong guesses. "They say he was touched by the marsh wind," said the mother. She didn't cry. She looked resigned, like this was the way things went. John nodded. He applied vinegar compresses, cut a vein, placed 3 leeches behind the ear and 2 beneath the ribs. The boy screamed once, then stopped. John stayed by him through the night. In the morning, the child died. The mother didn't blame him, but the baker did, and the innkeeper, and the butcher's wife, whose cousin had once been cured of gout by a traveling friar with holy water and a relic of St. Tilda. They didn't say it aloud, but John heard it in the way they stepped back, the way they stared at his hands, as if sickness lived in his fingernails. He cleaned the tools, burned the linens, marked the death in his little ledger. One more soul slipped through the cracks. But that night, someone nailed a dead rat to his door, and John understood. This was just the beginning. By the 5th day in Blewer's Hollow, the whispers had changed. It wasn't just the boy anymore. Someone said Physicker John didn't bury the body fast enough. Someone else said he cut it open before he prayed, that he whispered things under his breath when he touched the child's skin. They didn't have proof. But in a village like this, fear moved faster than fact. John stayed quiet. He always stayed quiet. He treated a farmer's dislocated shoulder without being asked. He stitched a gash in a shepherd's thigh and didn't charge a penny. And when a girl came to him one morning, coughing blood into a rag, he sat her by the fire, gave her hot ale with crushed fennel, and waited. She died too. Not quickly, not peacefully. It was the kind of death that settled over a house like fog, slow, bitter, and loud. This time they didn't knock when they came. 3 men, 2 holding clubs, 1 with a torch. John met them at the door with his hands open, palms out. "I didn't kill her," he said softly. The torchbearer didn't blink. "You didn't save her either." That was the problem. They didn't want miracles, not really. They just couldn't accept that the man who promised to heal might have no more power than a butcher or a priest with a dried-out bone, because that meant no one was safe. No matter how many leeches, no matter how many prayers. That night, they didn't hurt him. Not yet. But they took his books, tossed them into the square, and one by one set them on fire. John watched the flames lick through the margins, curl over the woodcut diagrams of livers and lungs, pages he'd copied by candlelight, gone in seconds. As the last one turned to ash, a child pointed at him and said, "Why does he look happy watching the fire?" He wasn't happy. He was tired. And maybe a little relieved. Because the moment the books were gone, he realized something simple. Now, they had nothing left to burn, but him. John left the square before the fire died. Not out of fear. He had long since learned that fear was useless in places where death lived under every roof. But staying would have meant watching. Watching his only tools, the ones that made him useful, that gave his life shape, turn to smoke. And he couldn't do that. Not again. The townspeople didn't stop him. They didn't need to. They'd made their point. He was still permitted to stay in Bluer's Hollow, technically, but the air around him had thickened into something heavier than smoke. Suspicion. That was harder to wash off than blood. He returned to the tithing barn alone. Inside, the shadows had grown teeth. The rats didn't run from him anymore. They watched. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the hearth, feeding it twigs and scraps, listening to the wind scream through the broken boards of the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled once, then silence. And in that silence, John began to remember. He remembered the monastery, the warm stone halls, the silence broken only by turning pages and whispered Latin, and Brother Alwyn, the monk who taught him the humors, who made him recite them aloud: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Balance these, Alwyn had said, and the body thrives. John had believed him, even when he lanced boils that oozed yellow pus like melted candle wax, even when he watched men scream as hot iron sealed their wounds, even when the herbs failed, the charms failed, the leeches wriggled useless in the bowl. He believed, but belief didn't stop the burning. The plague came in spring, carried on warm winds in the hands of merchants. Alwyn was the first to die, eyes wide, throat raw, whispering prayers that dissolved into blood. John had tried everything: fumigation with rosemary, powdered toadstone, bloodletting until the monks turned gray and breathless. None of it mattered. He was the only one who lived. He still didn't know why. He didn't want to know. He looked now at the jars he still carried, dried rue, foxglove, powdered bone, and realized how absurd they were. Useless weapons against an enemy that laughed at smoke and prayer alike. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open. John turned, heart slow but steady. It was a child. Thin, barefoot, face smudged with soot, eyes too big for his head. "My mother says not to talk to you," the boy said. John said nothing. "She's got a lump here." The boy pointed to his neck. "She says it's the devil's finger. She won't let anyone touch it." John stood, slowly, quietly. "Does it hurt her?" he asked. "She doesn't say." Of course she didn't. People in Bluer's Hollow didn't name their pain out loud. That gave it power. John knelt to the boy's level. "Can you take me to her?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. John grabbed his satchel, lighter now without his books, and followed, through the wet grass, past silent houses, into the sick-sweet rot of a thatched hut too small for secrets. The mother lay on a straw mattress, eyes glazed, lips cracked, neck swollen on one side, blackening around the edges. John didn't need a candle to know. He'd seen it before. The swelling, the black flesh, the faint smell of meat gone wrong. It was plague. Again, he didn't run. He didn't scream. He rolled up his sleeves and began. He did not expect to save her. But for once, that wasn't the point. She was dying before he touched her. John knew the signs too well. The swelling in her neck was no longer rising. It had reached its peak and was beginning to harden at the edges, the way meat stiffens when left too long in the sun. Her breath came in short, rattling bursts, each one shallower than the last. The plague had rooted itself deep in her blood. It was just a matter of time. Still, he worked, because that's what you did. Even when the work wouldn't save them. He crushed dried yarrow and angelica in his palm, mixing it with rainwater and a few grains of salt. Spooned the bitter liquid into her mouth. Her lips twitched, as if trying to spit it out, but she swallowed reflexively. "She'll sleep soon," he said softly to the boy, who sat on the floor with his arms around his knees, too quiet for someone that young. "She doesn't like to sleep," the boy murmured. "She says that's when the cough comes." John blinked. He hadn't heard it yet. But now, leaning close, he could see the tightness in her chest, the way her body resisted each breath, as if she was afraid to breathe. He dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it across her forehead. The lump on her neck pulsed once, slow and angry. "Did anyone else in the house fall ill?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "It's just us. Papa died last winter. My sister left for the convent. Mama says the Lord is testing us." John said nothing. He had no prayers left, only instinct and muscle memory. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a tiny, corked vial. Inside was a black powder, myrrh mixed with dried mint and bone ash. It wasn't a cure, but it could calm the lungs sometimes. He uncorked it and held it beneath the woman's nose. At first she didn't react. Then her head jerked, her eyes flew open, and she coughed, not a light clearing of the throat. A full-body convulsion that twisted her on the straw, sending flecks of dark blood onto the wall beside her. The boy cried out and scrambled backward. John moved fast. He rolled her to her side so she wouldn't choke. She coughed again, longer this time, then again. John counted them as he had so many times before. 1, 2, 3. On the fourth, a thick mass came up, bloody, yellow-black, reeking of rot, and splattered the floor. She sagged back, gasping, alive. For now. John cleaned her mouth with a damp cloth. Her eyes fluttered. Her skin, though still pale, had a trace more warmth. It wasn't healing, but it was relief. And sometimes that was enough. He turned to the boy, who hadn't moved. "You'll need to sleep somewhere else tonight," John said gently. "I'll stay with her." The boy nodded, eyes wide. As he left, John lit a candle and sat by the bed. He didn't touch her again, just watched. Counted her breaths. Whispered old Latin verses, not because he believed, but because the syllables were steady. Outside, the village was quiet. No dogs barking, no hooves clattering down the lanes, just the faint rustle of leaves in a wind too tired to howl. John leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest. And in that stillness, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't sick. Not yet. He had treated 3 plague victims in 5 days. 2 dead, 1 dying, and he felt nothing. No cough, no boils, no fever. It didn't make sense. He should have been ill by now, and that scared him more than the disease itself. Because if he wasn't getting sick, maybe he wasn't lucky. Maybe he was simply next. The candle burned low by the time dawn approached. Gray light pushed its way through the thatch roof in thin, dusty beams. The woman on the straw mattress stirred once, then fell still again. Not dead, not better. Somewhere in between, drifting along the edge where fever dreams blur into prayer. John didn't sleep. He watched her chest rise and fall. Too fast, too shallow, but still, moving. She wouldn't last 2 more nights. Maybe not 1. He rose to stretch his legs, bones cracking like old wood, and stepped outside into the cold morning haze. Blewer's Hollow looked the way it always did at sunrise, quiet, humble, uncertain. Smoke curled from distant chimneys. Chickens pecked at wet earth. But the silence wasn't peace. It was hesitation. They were watching him. From behind cracked shutters, from corners of half-open doorways, no one came close. But he felt it, eyes on his back like needles. He didn't blame them. To them, he wasn't just the man who couldn't save the boy or the girl. He was the man who walked among the sick and didn't fall. To them, that wasn't healing. That was witchery. He returned to the tithing barn just as the church bells rang once. Low and hollow. No service, no mass, just a signal. Someone else had died. Later that day, the alderman's assistant came, a short man wrapped in furs too heavy for spring. He stood just outside the barn and didn't cross the threshold. "Physiker," he called. "The council wishes a word." John looked up from his work, mixing willow bark paste, and wiped his hands on a rag. "I wasn't aware Blewer's Hollow had a council," the man smirked. "It does now." They met in the church, what remained of it. Half the nave was closed off by rotting beams. 3 men and 1 woman waited for him at the altar, all older, all dressed in black, not mourning, just preparing. The woman spoke first. "Do you know how many have died this month, John?" 8, he replied. 11, she corrected. 3 unrecorded. Infants, he nodded. "And yet," said one of the men, "you remain upright, whole, uncursed." John didn't answer. "You touched the girl," another said. "You cleaned her blood with bare hands. She was dying. You should be too." The room fell silent. John felt the air change. He had seen this before, in other villages, other towns. When the fear got too big to name, it needed a shape, a target. And people like him, people who worked in shadows, who touched wounds, who dealt with death, they were always the shape fear chose. "I'm not the cause," he said calmly. "You think the plague waits for permission?" "You're not the cause," the woman agreed. "But you may be the invitation." That night they posted a decree on the chapel door. Physiker John must leave Blewer's Hollow by moonrise tomorrow. No one said it to his face, but he read the parchment, folded it, slipped it into his satchel like one more forgotten page of a dying book. He didn't argue. There was no point. Instead, he walked to the edge of town, back to the boy's hut. She was still alive, barely. He checked her fever, changed the cloth, whispered a few words to the boy who still hadn't cried. Then he left a small jar by the hearth. Inside, mint oil, clove, dried myrrh. "It won't stop the sickness," he said, "but it might ease her pain." The boy nodded once, and that was it. John returned to the barn, packed his satchel, And by midnight, he was on the road again, into the woods, into the cold, into the silence that always followed men like him. Not a hero, not a healer, just a man with a needle, a book of ghosts, and hands that would never be clean again. The road out of Bluer's Hollow curved through bramble and frostbitten hedges, and John followed it with slow, deliberate steps. The night was still, but it wasn't silent. The forest spoke in creaks and rustles, and owls calling from black branches and unseen things slipping through underbrush. He didn't mind. Nature didn't judge. He had been cast out before. Towns changed, faces changed, but the rhythm stayed the same. Someone got sick, someone died, and then John became a question nobody wanted to answer. By morning, his legs ached, and the leather strap of his satchel had carved a line into his shoulder. He reached a fork in the path where a moss-covered milestone leaned crookedly. Craymere 6 leagues, carved into it in letters nearly lost to time. He sat, drank from a skin of sour ale, and removed his gloves. The fingernails on his right hand were dark at the base, not with disease, but with the soot of too many hearths, too many fires gone cold before dawn. John rubbed his fingers together. They still felt real. Sometimes he wondered how long that would last. He arrived at Craymere near dusk. It was larger than Bluer's Hollow. 24 stone homes, a smithy, and a church with a steeple that leaned east like a man afraid of bad weather. The air smelled of wet ash and rotting apples. No one greeted him. That was always the first test. If the town didn't spit or stare, he'd have a day, maybe 2. John set up under the old linden tree by the square, hung a faded scrap of linen over his travel crate. Physic and bone, aid for the afflicted. Then he waited. An old man came first, shaking hands, gums like bruised fruit. John gave him willow bark and a gentle oil for the joints. Payment? A single boiled egg and 2 turnips. Next, a girl with a twisted ankle. Then a coughing baker's wife. One by one they came, quiet, desperate. Not believers, just gamblers. People willing to wager their last bit of hope on the stranger with the haunted eyes. That night, John found lodging in the cooper's shed. Dry straw, thick walls, no rats. He slept for the first time in 3 nights. He dreamed of the boy. Not the one from Bluer's Hollow. A different boy. The first. He was 6, maybe 7. Skin covered in blue spots, tongue swollen, fever so hot it turned the sweat on his skin to steam. John had been 17. New to the monastery. Eager. Arrogant. He'd been allowed to assist Brother Alwyn just once, on this child. They lanced the blisters, applied pulses of mustard seed and vinegar, prayed. When the boy died, Alwyn had sighed, gently closed his eyes and whispered, "Some we lose." John hadn't cried. He'd gone to the chapel and scrubbed his hands until they bled. He never forgot that smell. Burned skin, vinegar, death. He awoke the next morning to shouting, not fear, not grief. John stepped outside to find half the town in the square. At the center, a woman, no older than 30, weeping as 2 men held her back. On the ground at her feet, a child, pale, still. They turned on him as if summoned by instinct. "You were here," one of the men growled. "You brought this." John didn't flinch. He knelt by the child, checked the tongue, the breath. Dead. Not plague, not fever. Poison. Mushroom, by the color of the lips. He ate something wrong, John said. They didn't listen. They never did. Someone threw a stone. It missed. Someone else spit at his boots. Closer. John stood slowly, met their eyes, and said, "Let me bury him." No one answered. He lifted the boy in his arms, lighter than a sack of bread, and walked to the edge of the field. He dug with his hands. No shovel, no prayer, just earth and blood and ash beneath his nails. When he finished, he stood alone. Even the crows had flown. The sky turned the color of bruised stone as John walked back to the square, fingers caked in earth, spine aching with the weight of that shallow grave. The child's burial had been quiet. No one helped, no one watched, and yet somehow he knew that every shutter had a face behind it, peering through a crack. By nightfall, his crate had been overturned. The linen sign, torn. His satchel rifled through. One of his bottles, a tincture of nettle and rosewater, shattered on the stones like a crushed beetle. He stared at the mess without anger. This was the cycle. He healed until people decided he didn't. Then he was the problem. A reputation, he'd learned, moved faster than plague. In Craymere, he lasted just over a day. He didn't wait for them to ask him to leave. He repacked what little remained, slipped away before sunrise, and followed the river east. The cold didn't sting anymore. It just settled into him, like another layer of skin. By the 3rd day, John found himself in Windmere Vale, a hamlet so small it didn't appear on maps if anyone bothered to draw them. The homes were little more than leaning timber, moss-chewed and damp. A single road coiled through like a snake too tired to strike. The village had a well. That was a good sign. The water didn't reek. Even better. He sat up by the well, unwrapped a fresh strip of linen, and inked a new sign in crooked script. Cures. Salves. Comforts. No promises. The first to approach was a girl with a lame foot. The bone had healed wrong, but she didn't ask for correction, just something to dull the ache. He gave her a compress of rosemary and mint. She smiled, thanked him with a stale crust of barley bread, and disappeared down the lane. Then came the old woman. Veiled, limping, nails thick as horn. She didn't speak, only held out her hands, palms up. John saw the sores, red-rimmed, crusted, yellow at the center. "Wasps?" he asked gently. She nodded. He cleaned the wounds, crushed some thyme into honey, and wrapped her fingers with moss. She winced, but said nothing. By dusk, 3 more had visited. None mentioned plague. None mentioned Bluer's Hollow or Kramer or the boy buried in the edge of a field. John allowed himself one breath of stillness, and then the wind shifted. A man stormed into the square, cheeks red with cold and rage. "She's choking!" he barked. "My wife! She's gone blue!" John followed without a word. The cottage was one of the better ones. Stone walls, a decent roof, even glass in the window. Inside, a woman lay on the floor, clutching her throat, eyes wide and frantic. Her lips were purpling. John knelt beside her, scanned the room. A stew pot on the hearth. He sniffed it. Metallic. Too metallic. "Did she taste this before it boiled?" he asked the man. The husband nodded, pale and shaking. John grabbed his satchel, pulled out a thick root, charred black at the ends, and mashed it with vinegar from the table. "Open her mouth," he said. The man hesitated. "Now." Together, they forced it between her teeth. She gagged, tried to spit, but the pulp clung to her tongue. Then, slowly, she coughed. Once, twice, and vomited. It was foul, reddish, but it meant her throat was working again. She gasped, cried out, and the blue faded. John sat back, breathless. "She lives," he whispered. The man didn't thank him. He just stared. A long, unreadable stare. "You should burn that pot," John said quietly. The husband nodded slowly. John left before nightfall. Back to the linden tree. He sat beneath it, staring up through the leaves just beginning to bud. The sky above was darkening. No stars yet. He remembered once, long ago, asking Brother Alwyn why people feared the sick. "Because illness reminds them they're mortal," the monk had said, "and people hate mirrors." A crunch of gravel behind him. John turned. It was the old veiled woman. She stood silent, then placed something beside him on the ground. A loaf of black bread, still warm, and then she was gone. The next morning they found another body, not plague. This time, murder. The body was discovered at dawn by a cooper's apprentice who had gone to fetch iron hoops for his master. It lay crumpled behind the barrel shed, arms twisted unnaturally, eyes wide open, staring at nothing and everything. A man, late 40s, missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The wound on his head where the skull had cracked was clean and deep, like something done not in rage, but with purpose. John stood just outside the circle of villagers, his hands folded beneath his cloak. He didn't need to see the body again. He could smell it, the metallic ghost of blood still clinging to the morning mist. "He was a trader," someone whispered. "From the coast, brought salt and fish. He cheated folk," another added. "But he didn't deserve that." The murmurs spread like mold on bread. None pointed fingers, yet, but John could feel it shifting in the air. The invisible thread tightening around his presence. A stranger arrives, a man dies. The math didn't need to be right to feel certain. The village reeve, a gaunt man with a permanent sneer, arrived late and said nothing for a long time. He crouched beside the corpse, poked the blood-matted hair with the end of his staff, and muttered, "Blunt object, close blow, no struggle." "Robbery?" someone asked. John knew better. No purse was taken, no boots stolen. The silver chain around the man's neck, still there, glinting beneath dried blood. This wasn't theft, it was removal. By noon, the reeve had questioned half the village. John expected to be summoned, but oddly, he wasn't. Not yet. Maybe the villagers feared he would place a curse upon them if pressed, or maybe they were saving him for last. Instead, he returned to the linden tree and quietly reopened his practice. A child with boils came first. Us. Then a man with gout so painful it made him weep. John worked as he always did, gently, methodically, saying little and listening less, but his mind stayed on the corpse. That night, he found himself wandering back to the barrel shed. The blood was gone, washed away by the apprentice, no doubt, but John paced the space where the body had fallen. There, behind the cracked cask, was a scuff mark on the dirt. Not from boots, no heel, something smooth and wide, dragged. The killer hadn't struck the man there. They'd moved him afterward. He knelt, running his fingers through the soil, and found a chip of something pale. Not bone. Clay. Curious. He pocketed it and turned, just as a voice whispered from behind the barrels, "You should leave." John didn't flinch. He knew the voice. The veiled woman. Her shape, slight and trembling in the moonlight, didn't match the threat in her tone. "This place is full of old sins," she said. "Some people here carry them in their pockets like stones." John stepped closer. Who was he? She didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, he was asking about the girl. What girl? Her mouth tightened beneath the veil. The one they buried without bells. The one whose name we don't say. John's breath caught. He'd heard hints, snatches of gossip under breath. A girl who died the winter before. No priest, no marker. Just a shallow grave and whispers. He said he was her uncle, the old woman added. But I don't think she had one. John looked back toward the village, toward the homes with their neatly swept thresholds and their eyes that never blinked. "There'll be more," he said. The woman didn't reply. She vanished into the shadows like smoke. Back in the shed, John unrolled his satchel and opened his book of remedies. He slid the chip of clay between the pages and made a note. Found near barrel, fired, unmarked, from local kiln? He stared at the words. They meant nothing, not yet. But they would. He could feel the pattern forming, like watching frost spread across glass, slow and silent until everything was obscured beneath it. And somewhere inside that frost was a secret nobody wanted uncovered. The name came to him the next morning, passed in a whisper from a flax spinner with a nervous cough and an eye that never met his. She didn't say it like a name, more like an apology. Margaret. It fell from her lips like a dropped pin. John repeated it once under his breath, turning the syllables over like smooth stones. Margaret. The girl whose death had been wrapped in silence. The one the traitor had asked about before someone silenced him. No bells had rung for her. No candle burned. Just soil and shame. By mid-morning, John found himself standing at the edge of Windmere Vale's old orchard. The trees were mostly dead, black-limbed and brittle, but one leaned far enough over the fence to look like it was bowing toward something hidden. The ground beneath it sloped slightly and had a shallow dip, as though once disturbed and never properly settled. John walked the perimeter slowly, eyes scanning the grass. Then he saw it, a broken comb, wooden, splintered, teeth missing, too fine field hand, too plain for a lady. He knelt and brushed the dirt away from the base of the tree, uncovering the rest of the comb, its wood darkened with age, still shaped faintly like a crescent moon. Beneath it, a scrap of cloth, buried shallow, blue, faded. He didn't dig deeper, not yet. That night, he didn't go to the linden tree. He stayed in the cooper's shed, oil lamp burning low, and opened his book to a blank page. Margaret. No record in parish scrolls, no burial on church grounds. Comb found, blue cloth, likely gravesite under old orchard. He stared at the words, then added another note. Traitor dead. Looking for her. Why? The next morning, the village changed. Subtly, people stopped looking him in the eye. Not from fear, but calculation. He could feel it in the way they closed their doors a little faster as he passed. The way conversations fell silent just as he stepped near. Whatever Margaret was to them, her memory wasn't buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. And John had disturbed it. That afternoon, the Reeve visited his shed. He didn't knock, just walked in, arms crossed, mouth a thin, grim line. "You've been asking about the girl." John didn't deny it. "She died," the Reeve said. "That's all." "Where's her family?" "No one left." "People say she had an uncle." "People say a lot." John closed his book slowly. "She was buried outside holy ground." "She wasn't." "Right," the Reeve said flatly. Never spoke, always staring, something wrong in the head. Her mother drank herself to death, and her father vanished before she could walk. We did what we could. You buried her in silence. We spared her shame. John stood. The Reeve's hand drifted to the knife at his belt. "Let it be. Physiker. This village don't need saving. It needs forgetting." John held his gaze. For a long, taut moment, neither man moved. Then the Reeve turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. That night, someone tried to burn the shed. The flames started at the base, oiled straw, easy to catch. but the door jammed open just enough to keep the blaze from building. By the time John returned from gathering herbs by the creek, smoke rose, but the wood hadn't caught. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he walked straight to the orchard. This time, he brought a trowel and gloves. He dug slowly, carefully, past roots and rocks, past the shallow layer where time tries to hide things, down to where the air turned cold and the dirt smelled wrong. He found the body less than 2 feet deep, wrapped in nothing but a shift, curled like a child in sleep. Her hair was still braided. He didn't touch her. He covered the grave again, more gently than he'd opened it, and marked the base of the tree with a line of white stones. When he returned to the village, no one spoke to him, but he noticed a shadow by the chapel, the veiled woman again. She raised one hand, just for a second, then turned and disappeared behind the gate. John entered his shed, wrote a single word on the last page of his book, murder. 3 days passed before another soul dared speak to him. It was a boy, no older than 8, who stood trembling outside John's shed at dawn with a scarf clutched to his chest. His nose bled. His hands were raw. His voice came out in a whisper. My mom's shaking. Her eyes roll. John knelt, gently pried the scarf loose, and saw the blotched skin already blooming along the child's arms. The rash was wrong. Not plague, not pox, something deeper, as if the heat came from inside the blood itself. Where do you live? The boy pointed north toward the row of cottages past the Thatcher's Lane, the ones with too many windows and not enough food. John followed in silence. The mother was half conscious when he arrived, slumped in her bed, her breathing ragged and wet. A shallow bowl of water sat by her side, but it had already gone cold. Her mouth moved when he touched her forehead, but no words came, just a moan, low and animal, like pain had stripped away the woman she used to be. There was another child in the corner. A girl this time. She didn't cry, just rocked slightly, thumb in her mouth, eyes hollow. John worked quickly, pulling herbs from his satchel, whispering instructions to the boy. Warm water, cloth, boiled root if they had it. He didn't tell him what he saw in the mother's eyes, the way the whites were tinged yellow, the black lines that had begun to spider down from the corners. Signs of something old, something forgotten by the men who sat fat in cities and called themselves physicians. He stayed until the fever broke, but it didn't break. Not truly. It waited. And by nightfall, 2 more houses had gone quiet. He lit a candle in the shed that evening and set his book on the table, but the page refused ink. His hands shook. Not from fear, that had long since grown dull, but from the weight of what he now knew. The sickness wasn't moving through food or air. It was moving through silence. He had seen this before, not in Windmere, but in a salt town years past, where miners bled from the nose and called it red cough. They buried the bodies in lime and sealed the well. The healer who told the truth was hanged by the Lord's steward for spreading unrest. And here, now, it had returned, dressed in different symptoms, perhaps, but the same rot beneath. He tried to write again. Margaret had died in this. He knew it now. She hadn't been wrong in the head. She'd been sick, like the boy's mother, like the trader who came asking questions, like the veiled woman who walked only at dusk. And someone had wanted that truth kept in the ground. He wrote 3 words on the page: the fever speaks. The next morning, the chapel bell rang once, not for mass, but for death. A single toll, heavy and late. He walked past the square where children once played and saw that the well was boarded shut. No one said why, no one claimed who ordered it. John returned to the orchard. The tree stood as before, still bowed, still watching. He laid his hand on the bark and closed his eyes. You were the first, he whispered. The wind stirred, dry and brittle, rattling the branches above. He opened his eyes to find the veiled woman standing across the field. She was closer this time, still silent, still watching, but now, waiting, as though he were the one being examined. He didn't move, and neither did she. By the time the frost returned to Windmere's fields, 6 more had died. No plague doctor's mask darkened the streets. No official seal was stamped on doors. The dead were buried in the narrow strip of consecrated ground behind the chapel, beneath unmarked stones, and prayers recited in hurried whispers by a trembling priest. Father Aldwin had taken to drinking by mid-morning and was often seen weeping beside the bell tower, muttering names no one dared ask about. John didn't sleep anymore. He watched the orchard from his window through the hours between dusk and dawn. The veiled woman came each night now, always standing in the same place, always facing his shed. The moonlight made her veil shimmer like ice on water, but her face was never visible. Her hands were always folded, her posture never changed, and she never approached. She didn't need to. The silence around her deepened each time she appeared. Not the peaceful silence of snow or sleep. This was the silence of a room where breath had stopped. It pressed against the windows. It seeped into the cracks in the door. It nested behind his ribs. He began to keep a candle burning at all hours. But the flame trembled when she came. And some nights it went out. One morning, while tending to a girl with blotched lips and a heart that fluttered too fast, John asked the child's grandmother if she'd seen the woman. The old woman nodded slowly. She watches the graves, walks the orchard at night. We used to leave milk for her, then salt, then ash. Her eyes filled with cloudy fear. Now we don't leave anything. Why? Because she doesn't take it. John tried to reason it away. Hallucination. Shared delusion. The fever could do that. Bend the senses, warp the mind. But he wasn't sick. Not yet. And the bell in the chapel had begun to toll even when no hand pulled its rope. That evening, as the light faded, he left his book open on the table and walked the narrow path through the orchard to the place where she stood. The frost crunched softly beneath his boots. His breath clouded the air, and in his hand he held nothing. No offering, no blade. Just the red scarf from the boy whose mother had not lived. She was there, just as always. Still, silent. John stopped 10 paces away. "What do you want?" he asked, not in defiance but exhaustion. "You've followed me through sickness and death. You've seen what I've tried to do. Is it not enough?" She tilted her head slowly as if listening, and then she lifted her hand, only slightly. Just enough to point, not at him, at the chapel. John turned his eyes toward it. A soft greenish light flickered in one of the upper windows, where no candle had burned in months, where no one had slept since the fever began. He looked back, but the woman was gone. Only the wind remained, and a single thread of red wool trailing behind him in the frost. He followed it, past the hedgerows, past the orchard's edge, back to the chapel where the door, once barred shut by the priest's trembling hands, now hung wide open on silent hinges. Inside, the air was warm, too warm, as if someone had just left. And on the altar, resting beside the worn book of rites, lay a piece of parchment scrawled in rushed, fading ink. The fever didn't come, it was called. The bell above creaked, but no one had climbed the tower. Not yet. John stepped inside, and the door closed quietly behind him. The chapel's stone walls, once cool and damp with age, now pulsed with a heat that did not belong. It was not fire, no flames, no glow, just the warmth of something alive and watching. John stood at the threshold, his breath catching as he listened. Not for voices, for the absence of them. It was the same silence the woman carried, but here it thickened. It pressed into the spaces between the pews and clung to the altar cloth like mildew. The air was wrong, not stale, but new, like a room just sealed shut after something terrible was hidden inside. He stepped forward, his boots echoing against the flagstone floor, dust scattered in the air like ashes. Candles long untouched remained half-melted in their holders, their wicks blackened and curled like tiny fingers. At the altar, the parchment he'd seen glowed faintly with the light of the moon through broken glass. The fever didn't come, it was called. He picked it up. The writing was familiar. Father Aldwin's hand, shaking, hurried, near illegible in places, but the fear was legible even in the strokes of ink. Words scratched like they were forced out by someone who could no longer bear their weight. John folded the paper and slipped it into his coat. He turned slowly toward the stairs. They curled along the inner wall of the bell tower, narrow, uneven, half-rotted in places. He gripped the rail, feeling splinters press into his palm, and climbed without hurry, not out of bravery, out of the cold understanding that the choice was no longer his. The bell waited. The air thinned as he ascended. Dust gave way to soot, and in that soot, on the walls, he saw them. Handprints. Dozens of them. Children, adults, old, young, pressed into the stone, smeared in streaks of black and gray, some with fingernails dragging downward as if pulled by something unseen. None were fresh, but none were fading either. At the top, the trapdoor hung open. John ducked through into the chamber beneath the bell. It was small. Wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, darkened with age. The bell itself, iron, cracked at the rim, hung motionless, but beneath it someone had placed a circle of white chalk on the floor, and within the circle, bones, laid carefully, arranged in human form, not buried, not burned, just waiting. He stared breathless. The bones were child-sized, and in the curve of the rib cage where the heart might have been sat a small glass vial sealed with wax. A red thread coiled inside it. John staggered backward, striking the wall. The bell above trembled. Not wind. He stepped forward again, knelt, reached out. A whisper filled the air. Not a voice, not sound, but language. Old, low. Like the creak of a door that shouldn't be opened, it moved through him. He touched the vial. It was cold. So cold it burned. He stood quickly, cradling it in one hand. The red thread inside pulsed faintly, as if responding to his heat or his heartbeat. Below, the chapel door groaned. Footsteps, slow, measured. He turned to the window. From this height, the village looked skeletal, houses like ribs pressing through the mist. And there she stood, the veiled woman, looking up at him. This time, she raised her hand not to point, but to beckon. The bell shook. Dust cascaded down from the beams, and the whisper behind him grew louder. John didn't wait. He shoved the vial into his coat, turned, and fled down the stairs 2 at a time, the air tightening around him like a noose. Every shadow along the stairwell seemed to flinch and shift. And still, the bell rang. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Loud, clear, and final. He burst through the chapel door into the cold air where the wind had returned and the frost bit through his coat like teeth. But the woman was gone, and the village behind him no longer felt asleep. It felt aware, like it had just woken from a long, fevered dream. And it had seen him. John didn't run, not exactly. His boots moved fast across the frost-hardened ground, but his breath was slow, shallow, measured. If he ran, the thing behind the whisper might follow. If he ran, the thread might tighten. So instead, he walked quickly, as if nothing were wrong, as if the weight in his coat was just another tool, not a sealed remnant of something meant to stay buried. The chapel faded behind him, but its sound didn't. Even as the bell fell silent, the echo of it followed him into the village lanes, low and vibrating like it had rung beneath the skin rather than through the air. Doors were cracked open now, curtains twitched. Faces peeked through with wide, silent eyes. No one spoke. They only watched him pass, like they knew, like they'd always known. He turned up the lane toward his shed. The wind had picked up again, brushing his cloak behind him and swirling dry leaves around his feet. The orchard waited beyond the hill, and beyond that, the veiled woman. But tonight, she didn't appear. He lit a candle inside. The flame flickered, not from wind, but from movement. Small, subtle shifts in the shadows. He drew the vial from his coat, unwrapped it with careful fingers, and set it on the table. The glass was damp with cold. Inside, the red thread pulsed again, slow and rhythmic, like a breath being held and released. John leaned close, no markings, no seals beyond the wax, no trace of who had made it or why. And yet, he remembered, not clearly, not fully, but in the marrow of his bones he felt a memory that wasn't his. Hands smaller than his, digging into the cold earth behind the chapel. A stone pulled loose, a face, pale and still, pressed against the soil, and a voice whispering, "It has to be bound, it mustn't scatter. The bones listen." He stumbled back from the table, knocking over a stool. The vial remained still, but the thread moved, just once, curled gently against the inside of the glass as if adjusting itself, then still again. John sat down, breathing hard. The fever wasn't a sickness, not exactly. It didn't come through food or rats or air. It came through memory, through presence, through remains. Something had happened in Windmere. Long ago, not a disease, but a choice, a ritual, a binding. And now something had broken it. He looked toward the orchard. Dark, quiet. He gathered his tools, the worn satchel, the last bundle of herbs he had dried for Margaret. Then he reached for the book, the one he never let others see. The one filled with diagrams and notes, copied in secret from the salt town where the dead bled from their mouths and no one dared speak of why. He opened to the last page he'd written on, and read aloud. "Where bone is not burned and blood is not bled, the memory will fester. It will whisper, and it will seek a body again." He turned the vial in his hand and saw something new, a faint fingerprint inside the glass, just behind the thread, so small it must have been made by a child. John's hands trembled. Outside, the wind dropped away, the stillness returned, and with it, a knock. Just one. Soft, at the door. He didn't move. didn't breathe. Then a second knock, lower this time. Not on the door, on the wall. He rose slowly, picked up the candle, and turned toward the far corner of the shed where the plaster had long since crumbled, and saw it, a fresh line of red thread slipping through the wall's crack from inside, as though something beneath the floorboards had begun to stitch its way up. The thread moved with purpose, slow and steady, like a vein growing in the wrong direction. It pulsed once, then coiled tighter into the gap between stones. No sound came from beneath, only that terrible suggestion that something had always been there, quiet, waiting, listening. John did not reach for it. Instead, he reached for the rusted pry bar he kept by the hearth. The cottage floor had always felt uneven underfoot, slightly sloped toward the northern corner. He'd once blamed poor masonry or the ground settling, but now he stepped lightly around the red thread and knelt by the boards. They were damp, the nails rusted. He wedged the bar beneath the nearest plank and pried it upward with a groan that sounded too much like a voice trying to speak. The board came loose, then another, and then in the hollow beneath the floor, he saw what he already knew he would. Not rats, not mold, not rot, but bone. A child's skull, delicate and pale, staring up from the dirt like it had never been buried. Around it, pieces of fabric, frayed linen, a hem sewn with white thread, a small shoe, blackened by soil, and in the dirt, dozens of red fibers like roots stretching outward from the remains. John recoiled, hand pressed over his mouth. The vial on the table shivered, the thread within it twisted once, like something waking. He looked at the open floor again, at the child buried in secret, no record, no marker, no grave. The memory bloomed behind his eyes. A winter night, a priest with blood on his hands, a fever they called a curse, and a village desperate to forget what they'd done to cure it. John stood quickly, heart pounding. He understood now. The fever wasn't a punishment. It was a reminder. Each time the memory tried to fade, the bones remembered. Each time the town looked away, it came back. This time it had come for him. The knock came again, but this time not on the door, not on the wall. From below. He turned toward the hole. The thread in the floor began to move faster now, pulling itself toward the center of the room, toward the vial still sitting open. John stepped between them. "No," he said aloud, the word feeling brittle in his mouth. He pulled the vial from the table and stuffed it back into his coat, then grabbed the red scarf, the boy's scarf, and wrapped it around the neck of the vial as tight as he could. The thread stopped moving, just for a moment. Then, scratch! The sound came from beneath the floor again. Scratch! Scratch! Not the thread this time. Fingernails. The bones beneath were reaching up. He dropped to his knees and slammed the floorboards back into place with trembling hands, hammering them down with the butt of the pry bar, sweat slicking his forehead. The red thread squirmed beneath like something pinned alive. When it was done, he backed away. The room was cold now, so cold it felt like the walls were breathing frost. The candlelight dimmed, and behind him a voice finally spoke. Not whispered, not imagined. Clear, close. A child's voice. "You heard it ring, Doctor. You can't pretend you didn't." John turned slowly. The door was still shut, the windows unbroken, but in the chair beside the hearth, where no one had sat in years, a small figure waited, pale, veiled, still, and from beneath her veil 2 red threads hung like tears. The girl sat motionless in the chair, feet not quite touching the floor, the ends of the red threads swaying faintly in a wind that did not stir the air. Her veil was stitched at the seams, an old shroud of muslin or some funerary cloth, yellowed with time and stained in places where water or blood had long since dried. She said nothing more, and yet John heard her, not through speech, but through the weight that now clung to every breath he took. It was a knowing, an imprint, as if her memory had entered the room before her body. He stepped back, slowly, his boot brushing over the uneven boards he had just sealed. The girl didn't move. She didn't need to. John swallowed. "You were one of them," he said. The words cracked in his throat. One of the children. No reply. Just a low sound beneath the floorboards. A rustle. Then a scrape. And silence again. His eyes dropped to the red threads beneath her veil. They weren't tied to anything. They simply hung, the ends fraying, brushing the edge of her lap as if moved by breath alone. She raised a hand. Not threateningly, just open, palm up. And in that moment, John understood what she had come for. Not vengeance. Not cruelty. She wanted the vial. The thread inside it belonged to her or to the others like her. The ones buried beneath cottages, hidden beneath floorboards, sealed in chalk circles to keep the fever from rising. She was a memory, yes, a spirit, perhaps. But more than that, she was a ledger. The last page of something Windermere had tried to tear from its own history. John shook his head. "I won't let it go," he whispered. "If I do, the fever starts again. It spreads." Her hand did not waver, but something in the shadows did. A second figure stepped from the edge of the room, small, bent, a boy this time, face gray, eyes dull, mouth stitched with black thread as if to keep his silence even now. His limbs twitched faintly as he walked, disjointed, wrong, as if remembering how to be a child only in pieces. Then another figure appeared. And another. Until John's shed was filled with them. Small forms, silent, each marked with some sign. A shroud, a stitch, a red thread, a missing hand, a torn collar. The children of the bones. The ones the fever had never truly taken because it was never meant to kill them. It had meant to contain them. He stepped backward until his spine touched the wall. "I tried to help," he whispered. And he had. He had brought salves, herbs, letters to lords that were never answered. He had held mothers as they wept and buried sons before dawn. He had tried, but in Windermere, truth was not rewarded. Truth had been buried, and now it had risen. The girl stood, slowly. The candlelight caught the veil and turned it golden at the edges, like dawn threatening to rise. John reached into his coat and drew out the vial. The red thread inside pulsed, once, twice, and then stilled as if waiting. The children watched, unmoving. John stepped forward, then dropped the vial into the hearth. The glass cracked instantly on the stone. The wax seal split with a hiss, and the thread uncoiled, not quickly, not violently, but deliberately, as if it had known this would happen all along. It slithered free, rose into the air, and split into many strands. Each thread reached toward a child, and they accepted it, willingly. The girl, veil untouched, stepped forward once more. And though she never spoke, John felt her words behind his eyes. "Now we remember, and you will carry us." The wind outside howled through the orchard, and when he blinked, the shed was empty. No children, no girl, just the red thread knotted neatly around his right wrist, as if it had always been there. Dawn never came that morning, at least not as John had known it. The sky brightened, yes, but in shades of ash and bruised lavender, a light without warmth. The orchard outside his cottage stirred in long, slow shivers. Branches creaked as if bearing the weight of names spoken in sleep. John stood alone by the hearth, staring at the knot now fastened around his wrist. The red thread pulsed faintly with warmth, not blood warm, memory warm, like a child's hand held too long or a fever just beginning. He dared not cut it. Even reaching for his knife made the skin of his forearm crawl, as if the thread wasn't just wrapped around him, but woven into him. He washed his hands 3 times that morning, once with ash, once with vinegar, once with snowmelt from the basin. The thread remained. He stepped outside into a village changed, not ruined, not dead, just quiet. The children he passed did not laugh or run. They walked in small groups, holding hands, eyes alert, faces unreadable. Some bore ribbons in their hair, others tied bits of string around their thumbs. A girl he did not know hummed a tune too old to have words. And every home had a red mark now, not painted, not carved, but sewn into cloth and pinned above the doors. Some were crosses, some were eyes, some were mouths sewn shut. John passed them all with his coat drawn tight, eyes down. The people did not speak to him, but they watched him, and all of them looked sooner or later to the thread on his wrist. By midday, he reached the chapel again. The door stood open as it had that night, warped slightly now, its hinges torn from the strain of things that should not pass. Inside, the pews had been rearranged. A circle, rough but deliberate. In the center, not an altar, but a pit. A small one, carved shallow into the floor, ringed with bundles of herbs, rusted nails, broken bits of dolls, wax seals split clean through. And in the pit, someone had placed bones, small, pale, arranged not with reverence, but intention. A priest stood nearby, but not Father Aldwin. This man wore no robes, no cross, just a gray tunic and a crown of dried nettles twisted into his hair. He nodded at John once slowly. "They remember you," the man said softly. His voice was dry, calm, like pages turning. John said nothing. "They've chosen you as their tether." John looked to the bones. "They should be buried." "They were buried," the man replied. "And the forgetting began. This time they remain above. This time we don't look away." A silence passed between them. Then John whispered, "What happens now?" The man stepped closer, and for the first time, John saw the red thread bound tightly around his own neck, like a noose. "You live," he said. "You walk the boundary. You carry their name and their warning." John looked again at the pit. The herbs had begun to smolder faintly, smoke curling upward in thin gray fingers. "You're not a priest," he said. The man smiled faintly. "No," he replied. "I'm the one who remembers the priest." And then he was gone, vanished like a breath into snow. That evening, John stood once more at the edge of the orchard. The wind moved slow and cold. The village watched from behind curtains, and across the field, as the moon rose, the veiled girl appeared again. But this time she smiled, and the thread around John's wrist pulled taut, gently guiding him forward into the dark. The moon rose higher. A pale coin hung in stillness, casting its wan light across Windermere's orchard. The trees no longer whispered. Their limbs no longer sighed. They stood now like quiet witnesses, hollowed, brittle, yet watchful, as if they remembered something the village would not speak aloud. John crossed the field slowly, each footstep swallowed by frost-crusted grass. The red thread at his wrist tugged with a subtle rhythm, not forceful, not cruel, just persistent, like a memory that refuses to fade, or a child who won't stop asking a question you've never answered. The veiled girl waited beneath the oldest tree. Her feet were bare, her hands folded before her, and when he drew near, John realized she was no longer alone. Behind her stood the others, children of different ages, some veiled, some bare-faced, all silent, all still. Their forms held together not by flesh or warmth, but by remembrance, as though they had shaped themselves from Windermere's forgetting, from the rot beneath its chapels, from the silence behind its doors. John did not speak. He simply bowed his head, a gesture no longer of grief, but of recognition. She stepped forward and lifted a hand. Her veil stirred, catching moonlight like gauze on water. Then delicately she reached out and touched the thread at his wrist. It unknotted. But it did not fall. Instead, it unraveled slowly, hovering in the air between them, and then, impossibly, it split. Half of it coiled back around John's wrist. The other half wrapped around hers. They were tethered now, two ends of the same wound. John felt it at once. Not pain, not fear, but burden. The weight of stories unspoken, of truths swallowed for generations. The fever had not been a disease. It had been a symptom of guilt, of memory, of oaths broken, and children silenced. And now it had found its voice. The girl turned and walked deeper into the orchard. The others followed. John went with them. They moved not like villagers, not like ghosts, but like keepers. Each step they took pressed the past into the soil, not to bury it, but to root it. He realized this was not a haunting. It was a planting. The orchard was a grave, and a ledger, and a covenant. They stopped at a hollow tree split near the base. One by one, the children placed small objects at its roots, bits of cloth, carved sticks, buttons, a tiny shoe. Then the girl placed her hand to the bark. The tree trembled, just slightly, enough to loose a creak from its center, and from that creak, a breath of wind escaped, warm and thick, heavy with the smell of old soil and something darker beneath. The girl turned to John, and for the first time spoke aloud. Her voice was soft, tired, timeless. "Remember us, that is all." John opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The winds stole them before they formed. The children faded one by one, their figures becoming mist, their shapes swallowed by branches. The girl was last. She pressed the end of the red thread into John's palm before vanishing. And then there was only him, and the hollow tree, and the cold. He stood there long into the night, until the stars dimmed, until the frost melted, until the bell in the chapel rang once, though no one touched its rope, and from that day on, Windermere remained quiet, not peaceful, not healed, but awake. And each time someone fell ill or a child disappeared or the orchard grew strangely quiet, they sent for the doctor, the one with red thread at his wrist, and a memory he was no longer allowed to forget. Years passed in Windermere, though they did not pass cleanly. The days lengthened and shortened, but never seemed to settle. Seasons changed without ceremony, summer stunted by sudden frost, spring arriving with bare branches that refused to bloom. And through it all, the doctor remained. John lived quietly. He tended the sick when they came, though fewer sought his hand now. Not from distrust, but from quiet reverence, as if approaching him required a kind of permission. He was not feared, nor was he wholly understood. He was carried, like a weight in the back of the throat, like a dream you can't quite shake. They called him Threadkeeper now. No one remembered who had first spoken the name. It simply settled like dust and was never wiped away. Um, the thread at his wrist had darkened with time, from blood red to something older, earthier, like rust or dried roots. It still pulsed sometimes, usually at night, when the wind turned warm for no reason, or when the bell rang without cause. He never cut it. He never tried. Even the thought of severing it made his skin crawl, as though the thread had grown under the skin now, stitched into sinew and memory. He no longer visited the chapel. Not since the tree had opened its breath to him. Instead, he walked the orchard paths when the moon was right, tracing the old children's offerings with his fingertips, adding new ones when he felt the need. Stones marked with chalk, black seeds, tufts of red wool. The roots accepted all. And still, the village endured. No plague came. No fever bloomed, but neither did joy. Windermere lived in the hush between those things, a town that had survived itself but had no songs left to sing. One evening, near the end of a gray and wet harvest, a stranger arrived. She came on foot, her cloak stiff with travel, her boots worn through. She carried no torch and asked no directions, just walked the road as if it remembered her weight from another life. John saw her from his window. The red thread at his wrist tightened. He stepped outside before she could knock. She stood in the dusk like someone who had just finished weeping. Her eyes were rimmed red, her lips cracked with cold. In her arms she carried a bundle, small, cloth-wrapped. A child. Sick. Breathing too shallow. John met her gaze. She didn't plead. She didn't bow. She only said, "They told me the fever came here once, and that someone answered it." John nodded. He took the child gently and carried it into the warmth of the cottage. The stranger followed, but did not cross the threshold. She stood outside as if the space inside belonged not to her, but to them, those who watched from behind walls and under soil. The child's breath was shallow, lips blue, hands clutching a ribbon that was tied at both ends, just like the thread once was. John unwrapped it and laid it beside the hearth. Then he reached for his herbs, not the ones he used for the living, the ones he used for binding. He worked in silence. The child never cried, only watched him with wide, watery eyes. When he placed the red thread from his wrist onto the child's hand, something inside him shifted. Not pain, not weakness. Release. The knot unraveled, and the room grew warm, so warm in fact that the frost on the window panes melted. The child breathed in, slow, deep, then closed their eyes in sleep. John stepped back, trembling. The thread now lay beside the child, loose, no longer his. Outside, the woman was gone, not walked away, just gone. And the orchard behind the cottage stood straighter that night, as if its roots had eased. Windermere did not change. It remained what it was, a village stitched with silence. But John slept for the first time in years. And when he woke, he no longer dreamed of bones. The days following that night were slow and soft, as if Windermere itself exhaled a breath it had held for centuries. The orchard's limbs, once knotted and brittle, seemed to stretch with an ease John had never seen. Even the wind felt lighter, carrying with it a scent of damp earth and new beginnings. John moved through his days differently, too. The red thread was gone. He no longer felt the subtle pull beneath his skin or the weight in his bones. His hands, once trembling with the memory of unseen burdens, now moved with a calm born from release. But peace in Windermere was never complete. On the third morning after the child's arrival, John found a message left upon his table. A small, folded slip of parchment sealed with a wax emblem he did not recognize. Unfolding it, he read, "The binding is never broken. It is only passed on. Remember this, the past does not leave. It waits in the spaces between. Be its keeper, not its prisoner." The script was elegant, measured, yet carried an urgent weight, like a warning whispered just beyond hearing. He folded it carefully, placed it beside the hearth, and stepped outside. The village stirred. Children played along the muddy lanes, their laughter tentative but genuine. Women hung laundry in the cool air, their voices light with song. Men worked in the fields, their backs bent but steady. John walked slowly to the orchard's edge. He touched the bark of the old tree where the children's offerings had once been laid. The bark was rough, scarred, and warm beneath his fingertips. A single red thread, thin and fragile, was woven into the gnarled roots, barely visible yet unmistakable. He smiled softly. The burden was lighter now. Not gone, but shared. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, John returned to his cottage. The night was quiet, but not empty. For in the hush he could still feel the whispers, the memories, the children who had once been forgotten, now remembered. And through it all a single truth remained. Some stories must be carried, not to be cursed, but to be honored. And so, beneath the cold stars of Windmere, John, once a man marked by fever and silence, walked into a new dawn, one woven not with fear, but with remembrance. The seasons spun their slow, relentless dance around Windmere. Leaves turned gold and fell, only to be buried beneath white blankets that melted too soon. The orchard, once a silent sentinel of sorrow, had softened into a place of quiet vigil, where shadows no longer seemed to clutch with cold fingers, but stretched gently in the light of fading afternoons. John had changed, though not entirely. The years etched lines around his eyes and stiffened his shoulders, but they had also taught him a strange grace, a patience born from holding the unseen in one hand while tending the living with the other. Each morning, he walked the village paths, visiting the homes where stories lived beneath cracked plaster and peeling paint. He listened more than he spoke, letting the whispers of past and present mingle beneath his breath. Some villagers still avoided his gaze. Others greeted him with a quiet nod, as if acknowledging a shared burden too deep for words. On one such walk, beneath the stretched shadows of late afternoon, John paused by the orchard's edge. The oldest tree stood as it always had, gnarled, weathered, its roots tangled with secrets. He placed a hand against its rough bark, feeling the steady pulse beneath, not unlike his own. From the branches above, a single red leaf fluttered down, landing softly at his feet. He picked it up, noting its veins glowed faintly like the pulse of that long-ago thread tied around his wrist. A breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of earth and something else, something ancient and gentle. In that moment, the orchard seemed less a place of mourning, more a sanctuary of remembrance. John closed his eyes, letting the quiet wash over him. He understood now that the fever had never been a curse, nor the children mere ghosts. They were echoes of a truth too heavy for forgetting, and he, their keeper, would walk beside them, not as prisoner, but as guardian. The village might never fully heal, but beneath the sorrow and silence something fragile endured, a thread of memory, a whisper in the turning leaves. And with that, the orchard sighed once more. As night settled softly over Windmere, John lingered a moment longer, then turned toward home. The shadows lengthened, but he carried the dawn within him, and the stories finally had found their voice. The years slipped onward, each season folding into the next like pages in a book whose edges were frayed and worn. Windmere remained perched between memory and silence, a village whose heartbeat echoed in the cracks of its ancient stone and the whispering boughs of its orchard. John had grown older, his hair streaked with silver like frost on winter branches. He moved with a deliberate quietness, a man accustomed to shadows and half-heard voices. The red thread, once vivid and alive, had faded into a pale line beneath his skin, a subtle mark of a bond neither easily broken nor forgotten. One dawn, as the sky bled soft pinks into the cold air, John ventured once more beneath the orchard's canopy. The ground was dusted with the first frost of late autumn, crystals sparkling faintly like distant stars caught between earth and sky. His breath came slow and visible, mingling with the mist that curled between the gnarled trunks. He paused by the hollow tree, the one that had breathed warmth into his hands so many years before. A faint shimmer hovered near its roots, a single red thread, delicate and thin, woven through the earth like a whispered promise. John knelt, tracing the thread with fingers roughened by time. The soil beneath was soft, almost yielding, as if waiting. He listened, not for voices, but for silence. The silence of those who had passed, the silence of stories left untold, and beneath that silence something deeper still, a breath held steady, a presence just beyond reach. From the corner of his eye, a shadow flickered. A child, no longer veiled, no longer bound by threads, stood watching. Her eyes held the weight of centuries and the quiet peace of knowing. She smiled, not with joy but with remembrance. John reached out a hand. She took it. Together, they walked through the orchard, the frost melting beneath their feet, leaving behind only faint traces, a red thread woven softly into the earth, an echo beneath the frost. And as the sun rose fully, gilding the village with fragile light, John understood at last. Some burdens become blessings when carried with grace. Some whispers become voices when heard with courage. And some stories, long buried in shadow, find life anew in the quiet unfolding of dawn. In the deep hush of winter, Windermere held its breath once more. The snow came slowly that year, drifting down not with urgency but with solemn purpose, as though it remembered where it had fallen before. It layered the roofs, softened the crumbling stones of the chapel, and settled along the orchard limbs like white lace over ancient scars. John remained within the quiet. His hair was now entirely white, his gait slower, but he moved still with the same steadiness he always had, like someone walking through an old dream they'd made peace with. The village rarely disturbed him. They brought their sick, their quiet sorrows, and their stillborn hopes, but they never asked about the red thread or the hollow tree or the children who no longer came. They felt those things now, deep beneath their skin. Windermere had learned not to question the hush it lived within. But even silence changes, and one morning, it did. The frost had crept along the windows in careful patterns, spirals, sigils, root lines. John watched it from his bed. The orchard beyond stood stiff with snow, but something beneath it shifted. He rose and wrapped himself in wool, no boots, no staff. He walked barefoot through snow and memory. The orchard didn't seem cold, it seemed expectant. The hollow tree had changed. Its bark, once rough and split, had begun to regrow, curling inward around its old wound. From the center of the hollow, something had begun to rise. A sapling, red-stemmed with thin, trembling leaves the color of blood fading into dusk. John approached, hands open. He did not touch it. He only knelt. For a long while he listened. Beneath the snow, beneath the silence, something stirred. Not a child's voice, not a fevered whisper, but something older, a root memory, a voice that had not been heard in lifetimes. And it said, "Now you may rest." He wept, not from sorrow, from completion, from the knowledge that the burden had taken root and would not be lost again. The children had not been forgotten. Their pain had been named. Their silence had become story. And the village, though it would never speak of them aloud, would feel them. In the warmth of the hearth, in the stillness after snow, in the red blossoms that would come with spring. John sat beneath the tree until nightfall. No one came for him. No one needed to. When the morning sun returned, its light fell gently on the sapling's leaves, and beneath it, John's footprints remained in the snow. But John himself was gone, not vanished, given back, to the orchard, to the hush, to the ones who never truly left. Spring came to Windermere in silence. No fanfare, no bright bird song, only the soft release of frost from soil and the slow exhalation of the land awakening again. The chapel bell did not ring. It hadn't in years, though no one dared take it down. Instead, it hung there like an unanswered question, tarnished, waiting, watched. And beneath the budding sky, the orchard breathed. The villagers noticed it first in whispers. Children returned from play with petals in their hair, thin, red, heart-shaped leaves not found anywhere else. No one could say how they'd bloomed so early, nor why they seemed to fall only near the oldest tree, the hollowed one, now thick with life once more. The sapling at its base had grown, taller now, stronger. Its bark was still red-veined, and its leaves still carried that strange dusk hue. But there was a grace to it, a stillness that made the wind quiet as it passed. Some said they saw figures beneath its branches at twilight, small figures, familiar, but they never stayed long enough to be named. One morning, a child named Ellen wandered to the tree, cradling a doll with a threadbare red sash. She knelt without fear and placed the doll gently at the tree's roots. When she stood, she said softly, as if to someone unseen, "Thank you for remembering." She didn't know why she said it, only that it felt true. And so the village carried on. No monuments were built, no stories were written down, but each spring, small red ribbons were tied to the orchard fence. Each winter, footprints appeared in the snow around the hollow tree, small, light, vanishing before dawn. And every few years, when someone in Windermere fell sick with something no doctor could name, they were taken not to the chapel, but to the orchard. They were left there with quiet prayers and thread-bound tokens, and almost always they returned healed. Almost always. No one spoke of John anymore. Not because he was forgotten, but because he remained in the roots, in the wind, in the hush between seasons. Some claimed to see him, an old man with white hair and red thread at his wrist, walking the orchard paths at dusk. He never spoke, only smiled and vanished between the trees. The orchard knew. It remembered what the village tried to bury. It remembered the fever that was not a curse, the children who were not lost, and the man who carried their silence until it blossomed. So when the bell finally rang again, once softly without hands to pull it, no one ran. No one wept. They only listened. And in that sound, like breath drawn after long sleep, they heard the end of forgetting. And the orchard, swaying in spring's soft wind, listened too, for it remembered everything.